Lane Community College presents the Lane Peace and Democracy Conference.
And can you really succeed in war in the first place? You know, is there such a thing as winning a war?
We have now surpassed the military budget of the rest of the world combined.
The world can no longer entertain the delusion that the U.S. standard of living is possible for the entire planet.
I've tried the kumbaya, and we're all the same, and you know, that doesn't work anymore.
Just as war is too important to leave to the generals, civil liberties is too important to leave to the lawyers.
Women are standing up in these prestigious positions, and it's time.
We live in a society that is unequal, that is unjust, that is full of oppression and racism.
We need to commit to removal of all our forces.
And a favorite law enforcement tactic is to disturb a hive and then listen for the buzz.
You do not clear-cut forests to make toilet paper.
And then the riot police came in and told us, okay, everyone needs to stand in the sidewalk unless you want to get pepper sprayed or arrested.
And the Peace Center will be an important element in making a difference for ourselves, our community, and in time, the world.
And that all rights are equally important. The right not to be tortured or the right to vote is as important as the right to shelter and the right to food.
The biggest threat to humanity, it does come down to massive death.
Pepper spraying and shooting automatic rubber bullets into the crowd, so it sounded like machine gun, and everyone was pretty scared.
And our country has 1 out of every 100 of our people in jail.
The world economic system is destabilizing.
Terrorist acts are better treated as criminal acts with political implications rather than as an act of war.
The need to teach peace is obvious. The need to teach people other values besides war is obvious.
And if we leave it to a political party and a leader to decide whether to bring those troops home, they're not coming home.
So basically what I would like to do, I've got a PowerPoint that's a Know Your Rights training. And generally, the training is geared toward people who are already involved in some form of activism. It is meant to give you your basic rights so that you know where the line is drawn between legal and illegal so you can make your own choices. I'm not here to advocate that people get arrested or not get arrested. That's obviously your own personal choice. Let's see if I can work this. Okay. So, whether or not you are a U.S. citizen or not, every person in this country and in certain areas where U.S. law is recognized have a certain number of rights. And many of these you have probably heard from TV or movies, like your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. This gives you the right to not answer any questions asked by a police officer or a government agent, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. You also have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. This is what's called the Fourth Amendment, if you have heard those buzzwords. And this is supposed to be your right to privacy. This is what makes your castle sacred, your car, your personal belongings, and you yourself. Unless the police have a warrant in most circumstances, they can't search you or any of your stuff or places where you reside. Unless they get a warrant. And there are certain exceptions to this, like if it's an emergency, if it's in plain view, if a police officer comes up to your front window and sees a giant bong on your coffee table, that's plain view, and that could give them probable cause to enter your house without a warrant. However, since 9/11, we've had several laws that have expanded the government's right to encroach upon some of these rights. And the Patriot Act is probably one of the most popular that most people know about. The Patriot Act, in essence, completely gutted the Fourth Amendment, absolutely destroyed it, and basically said you no longer have the right to privacy in your home because any government agent without a warrant could now enter your home, take things from your house, download your hard drive, photograph, do whatever they want, and then leave without telling you that they were even there. But I will let you know that there was a case in Oregon that got ruled on about 3 months ago by Judge Aiken in the Eugene Federal Court that said that the sneak and peek provision of the Patriot Act is unconstitutional, which all of us knew, but it took a while for the courts to get there. And the feds are actually appealing that now because they are in disagreement about that. But so we're hopeful that that provision is going to be eradicated soon. No, it was supposed to sunset when it was originally passed, but then Congress passed what was called the son of the Patriot Act, Patriot Act 2, and that in essence made that law permanent. So a law that was passed, and I think it was something like 93% of our elected representatives admitted that they had never read that law before they voted it into law. And part of the reason they said that they were comfortable in not reading a law before making it binding on all of us was because it did have this sunset provision. And a little bit off topic of it, but the Patriot Act also, before it was passed after 9/11, it had been brought to Congress several times before as the FBI's wish list. And Congress had shot it down time and time again because of its unconstitutional provisions and its very overbearing nature. But in the wake of 9/11, they used that crisis as the leverage for them to be able to pass that law. So a couple other things that I wanted to just mention to you. If law enforcement ever does show up at your house or your workplace or your office or wherever it happens to be, even if the police say they have a warrant, you want to demand to see that warrant. The warrant has to say on the face of it your address, what they're allowed to search, what they're allowed to take. All of those details have to be in it, and you do have the right to view it. If they have a warrant, you're not going to have many other rights. You know, you don't want to interfere with them. You don't want to get in their way because you're going to end up arrested if that's the case. But you do have the right to have a copy of the warrant and see what it is that they're being authorized to take. And normally you also, if you are the property owner, you have the right to observe the search that's taking place and what they actually are removing from your house. Even if they have a warrant and they show the warrant to you, you never want to consent. This is kind of a common tactic where they'll say, look, we've got a warrant, now will you let us in? You still don't want to consent because there could be something wrong with that warrant legally, and a lawyer is going to review that after the fact. If you consent, you've now made it so they don't need that warrant. You've given them permission to enter and do whatever they are going to do. So even if they have a warrant, you want to basically tell them, you know, I'm going to stand by my rights. I don't consent to this search and seizure. And that paper trail that will be created by the officer gives your lawyer something to work with down the road if it ends up being that way. Another important thing to remember is your roommate, a guest in your house, an employee or your employer can all consent to the police entering your home if the police believe that that person has the authority to give them permission. So if an adult roommate answers the door and says, oh yeah, come on in and search the whole place, you're not going to have the right to fight about that as the actual property owner. So it's important, in my opinion, you know, and I instruct all of my employees to give them a little basic primer. You know, this office does not consent to searches and seizures. If anyone ever shows up here, you don't have permission to let them in. And we even have a little thing on our door that says, you know, we don't consent to any searches and seizures, just so that if something stressful ever happened and the FBI show up at the door, someone who is uncomfortable with challenging the police or speaking up for themselves can simply say, I'm sorry, my mean boss told me I would be fired if I consent, and I have to read you this card now. And, you know, it's a way to ensure that your rights are going to be protected. If the cops have an arrest warrant for you, which is different than a search warrant, a warrant for your arrest means you've been indicted on a crime or you didn't show up for court, and the warrant says we can come and seize the human. If the police show up with an arrest warrant, they are allowed to search your wingspan, your reasonable proximity. And so oftentimes I will be reading police reports and somebody finds out the cops are at the door for them, and they run into their bedroom and hide in the closet where they also happen to have their meth, their scales, and all their other private stuff, and they've just allowed the police into that sanctum. Whereas if they had sat on the living room couch and the police came in, they would have only been able to search in that area, and they wouldn't have been able to get into that back area. So just remember, you know, and they're good, if they're at your house, you climb under the bed or whatever you're going to do, all that's going to do is put you at risk of being physically injured as well. If the cops are at your door, chances are you're not getting away today, and you should probably just be thinking, how can I best make this interaction as safe as possible and preserve all of the rights that you have. You have the right to advocate for change. You have the right to speak your mind. You have the right to disagree with the government. You have the right to chastise the government and criticize them. And no matter what's going on, whether it's perpetual war or a natural disaster, those rights cannot be circumvented or put on hold, despite what the government seems to say. However, for those of you that are working in communities or with groups that have immigration issues going on or non-U.S. citizens, it's important for you to know that although everybody in this country has the same First Amendment rights technically, the INS can round somebody up and deport them for any reason whatsoever. And so non-U.S. citizens who are advocating for change are really putting themselves in a double concerning predicament, because their speaking their mind could potentially garner them the attention of INS, and for no reason but the fact that they're out at a rally, they can be targeted by Homeland Security and ultimately deported. So this just basically is emphasizing that the Patriot Act or this war on terror or all of the other things that George Bush keeps telling us why our rights might be suspended is completely untrue. The only thing that can ever suspend constitutional rights is martial law, which has only been imposed once in the history of our country. And we can maybe talk about that a little bit more in the question and answer if people have concerns of that. So there are 3 levels of police interactions with citizens: conversation, detention, and arrest. Each one of these levels have different rules or different amounts of interaction that law enforcement can have with you. But for all of these levels, the bottom line important thing to remember is you never have any obligation ever to speak to any public official or law enforcement agent, whether it's FBI, INS, TSA, NSA. You never, ever have to voluntarily speak with them about anything at all. Just in the same way as I could walk up to you and ask you right now for your social security number, you could give it to me, but you could also tell me, I don't want to give you that number. The police can do the exact same thing. They can walk up to you at a rally and a demonstration and ask you who the organizer of the event is. And you have the absolute right to not answer that question at all times. Only a judge has the legal power to order you to answer questions. No one else ever has that same authority. So we basically advise people, if you choose not to speak with law enforcement, you just need to clearly tell them, I'm sorry, I don't wish to speak with you, and then we advise that you politely and slowly just walk away from the situation. Police are allowed to lie, and so even if you asked, are you a cop, law enforcement is legally allowed to say, no, I am not, and that's just the way it goes. So you can never really, you never really know, is the bottom line. So if it's a stranger, you should probably be viewing them with some skepticism. The next level is detention, and detention can only happen if a police officer has a reasonable suspicion that you have committed a crime or are about to commit a crime. And this can't be you just happen to be at a demonstration where a window got broken and so they're going to detain you and ask you who else was at the rally or something like that. It has to be an articulable, reasonable suspicion that you have committed a crime. There is no such thing as guilt by association in our set of laws in this country. And so they have to be able to tell you why you are being detained. So if you are going to be detained, if law enforcement approaches you and says, we'd like to speak with you, obviously the badge in your face, gets the adrenaline running, and all of a sudden you're really nervous, and sometimes words come flying out of your mouth. So one of the first things that I always tell people is make sure that you take a deep breath and you stay calm and in control of your words. They are going to write down a lot of what you're saying to them. There is nothing that is an innocent word said to law enforcement. They are trained to prosecute criminals, and you should also know that the less you say, the better in most circumstances, because I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with a client and the police report, and they will tell me that there are several things in that report that they never said, that were literally added after the fact. And so that's why, we'll get to this in a minute, but that's why you always want a lawyer near you when you are making statements to law enforcement, mostly so that you do have a witness to what you just said. Because after that fact, it's your word against a police officer's word, and I'll tell you, in a jury trial, that is a very uphill battle for most people. You never want to run or physically resist a police officer, even if you think they've got no basis, that they're just harassing you, et cetera, because, again, you're likely to then give them that probable cause to arrest you, and they're probably going to injure you to boot. The magic words you want to ask, if a police officer says, I want to speak to you, the first thing you should say is, am I being detained or am I free to leave? Those are the magic words, and we'll be going over magic words a little later. But that phrase, am I being detained and am I free to leave? First of all, any law enforcement officer that hears that will know you've learned those magic words. That's a legal phrase, and it has important meaning if a court were to get involved. And if the answer is, well, I just kind of wanted to talk to you, then that's when you would say, well, thank you, officer, I don't wish to speak with you, and then you would walk away. If he says, yeah, I'm detaining you, he needs to give you a basis why, and then you do need to, at that point, stand there and not try to walk away or anything. You are required to provide identification, police can ask you to identify yourself at this stage, but you don't have to have an actual driver's license or an ID card unless you're in a car. So, and this is kind of a double-edged sword. By law, you don't have to carry ID yet. The Real ID Act takes effect in May, and then things may change again. But at this point, we don't have to carry our travel documents around with us. And so you don't have a legal obligation to have a license on you. But if a cop asks for you to identify yourself and you don't have that ID, they have the right to detain you until they can reasonably identify you. And so that can mean hauling you to the cop shop and running your fingerprints or putting your mugshot into a computer in order to verify your identity. I've actually had the police Google my name while I stood there so that they could see a picture of me on our website and know that it was me. because I didn't have a license on me. So there are ways that they can identify you other than having a driver's license, but expect it to take longer and expect it to be a little bit more of a hassle if that ends up being your case. And if you are in a car, of course, you are, well, if you're the driver of a car, you are required to have ID, obviously. So if you're not free to go, you want to ask why you are being detained. You may have to provide your name, your address, your date of birth, but you don't ever have to say anything else. You never have to give them a social security number, ever. The only people that you ever have to give your social security number to is like the IRS. The only people that need that number is for financial reasons. So you don't have to give it to cops when you're being detained. And for those of you that might work with immigrant communities, you never have to give the police information about your status, your nationality status, including where you were born. And I often see police trying to do that with people of Mexican origin, and especially in Lane County. A police officer, oh, okay, so just to make sure everyone's reading along here, it is a crime to give a false name. So it is far more advisable to you to give no name at all if you want to really hold on to those Fifth Amendment rights. You do have the right to not give your name and become a John Doe, but if you gave a fake name, then you will be charged with giving false information to a police officer, which is a misdemeanor. And I will tell you, from working with the Forest Movement, lots of people will get arrested and all of a sudden their name is Mosshead or, you know, Stumpy or whatever it's going to be. And law enforcement has recently viewed that as giving them a false name, and we've had a round of people who were using aliases who were charged with false information to police officers. We won those cases, but they did get charged with it, and it was a reason to keep them in jail and make them pay bail and, you know, the whole 9 yards. Police officers have to identify themselves. A police officer is supposed to be wearing a badge and a badge number or a name at all times when in uniform. Certainly, if they are undercover, they don't have to be visibly wearing that information. But if they're in uniform and they're not wearing a badge or an identifying badge number, that means that they have intentionally removed that item of required uniform. And you should be aware of that, because that's something not only do you want to note and potentially tell your lawyer, but that's usually not a particularly good sign when you're in a demonstration or rally situation. Just so you know, though, if a police officer is holding back 55 protesters at WTO and you're sitting there saying, "What's your badge number? They don't have to give you that information when you want it. It's just that they have to reasonably identify themselves at some point, and that can be in a police report that you get 3 weeks later. So don't think that you have an automatic right of saying, "Officer, what's your badge number?" and they immediately have to answer you, which, you know, a lot of people have thought that and get all mad when it doesn't happen that way, and it's because they don't really have to. If you're being detained, they're allowed to pat you down. Mostly they're looking for weapons. This is officer safety at this point. They're only kind of sussing you out at this point. So they can pat you down if you've got, you know, something that looks like a gun, but they're not allowed to look in your trunk or, you know, start opening up little containers in your pockets or anything like that. And of course, especially if you are in a demonstration scenario, you want to immediately take notes of what happened, especially if there are not legal observers present. All of these things, you know, what agency it is, what the cops' names were, who they were arresting, all of that information can be really important down the road. You have the right to be searched by a person of your gender. And so women do have the right to have female officers present if it's going to be anything more than that immediate, "Are you going to shoot me?" search. So that's basically how the line is drawn there. So the next thing you want to ask as this detention is going forward is, am I under arrest? And basically, this triggers a couple of extra protections. Number one, police cannot move you from where you are unless you are under arrest. So this means if you get stopped on a sidewalk and you're being detained, and all of a sudden the police officer says, why don't you walk over to my car with me, let's go down this alley, I want to speak to you, you are lawfully allowed to say, no, I'm going to stay right here in this public area, and if you're going to arrest me, I want these people to see it. So you don't have to go with the police officer until they're going to put handcuffs on you. And at that point, of course, they can move you to a police car or whatever they're going to do. At that point, you are probably not going to convince this police officer to unarrest you. And so we advise people at this point to assert those Fifth Amendment rights, ask for a lawyer, and tell them that you're going to remain silent. If you were injured in this process, whether it's by a police officer, whether it's pepper spray, whatever, you immediately have to start making those needs clear. And you're probably going to have to repeat them several times while at the jail. If you are under 18, for those of you that are working with movements with youth involved, or if you have kids yourself, juveniles have exactly the same rights as adults in the public forum. Obviously, in schools it's a little bit different, but in the context of them out, at rallies or demonstrations, they have the exact same rights as we as adults have. However, a person under 18, if they are actually taken to jail, will not be allowed to bail themselves out. They have to have a parent or guardian physically come and pick them up. This becomes an important little factoid if your kid is going to travel to another state for a demonstration. You want to make sure that there's some adult going with them, that you've given a little signed piece of paper saying, I give this person permission to deal with my child, so that if somehow they get arrested, that person can get your kid out without you having to fly to Idaho or something like that. Okay, so you're going to be arrested, you're going to be going to jail. Police can arrest you if they see you breaking the law, or if they have a witness, a citizen witness, that is willing to sign a complaint saying we have probable cause to believe that you have committed a crime, or if you have an arrest warrant, which has to be signed by a judge for your arrest. And then I just kind of threw in here, for those of you that have ever engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience, you are obviously breaking the law right in front of many police officers, and of course they then have automatic probable cause to arrest you. At this point, when they have actually arrested you, they are now allowed to search you to the skin. And what this means, is they can strip search you, so to speak, or they can definitely do a much more intensive, what do you got on you? Any bags, anything in your vehicle that is within your wingspan, like under the seats, your glove box. They are not allowed to search your trunk unless they get a warrant for that. But anything else really in your car, expect them to be able to search at that point, including, if you were out on the streets, your backpack, et cetera, et cetera. And again, like we mentioned before, the person searching you has to be your own gender. A couple of other little tidbits. If you have an illness or medications or any other issues of concern to you, at this point you need to start telling officers, I'm diabetic, I'm transgender, whatever your issue needs to be, you need to start articulating it. And when you get to jail, the only way that you will get anything is by something called kites, which are these little slips of paper that are the communication devices of most jails. Almost all jails have, they might not call it a kite, but they'll have this little slip of paper. If you need meds, if you think you've got a broken bone, whatever it happens to be, you are going to need to start sending kites, because it's going to probably take a while for you to get medical treatment. And just so you understand this and pass it back to your communities, if you are arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience, you're not going to be in the jail for very long in most circumstances. Usually it's called cite and release, which means within 5 hours you're going to be let go. And under those circumstances, jail policy says that they do not have to provide you with any medical treatment unless you are dying. So if they don't see respiratory distress or blood gushing out of some part, they are legally allowed to just let you sit there with the broken wrist or whatever it happens to be. So the other thing I learned recently from a civil rights case I'm working on is the medical people are viewing you without telling you. They are observing you from afar to determine whether you're going to live and die in the next 5 hours. And so if you are pacing and talking and freaking out because you're in jail and you have a broken finger or something like that, they're going to write down, oh, he's fine, and he doesn't even need an ice pack. So just be aware that and pass it on to other people if you ever are arrested with people who are injured, that's probably what's going to determine whether or not they get any medical care at all for that 5-hour time period. So, the magic words. I'm going to remain silent and I want to contact an attorney. This immediately invokes your Fifth Amendment rights. And once you say those magic words, the police legally must stop asking you any questions at all. If you then voluntarily begin talking to them again, you must assert these rights again in order to invoke them. Once you break the silence by starting to talk to them again, you've undone your Fifth Amendment rights, and you have to impose them again to have the law protect you from them. And even if you don't have a lawyer, you have the right to a lawyer. They have to give you a phone book. And oftentimes people think, well, I didn't have a lawyer and I didn't think I could pay for one, and it's a Friday night and I just got arrested for drunk driving, so I just decided I'd start talking to them because I knew I was screwed. Well, that's a bad idea, especially if you think you have any chance of fighting the charges down the road. And part of why it is so fundamental to assert your right to a lawyer, again, talking to the FBI without a witness present, or talking to law enforcement generally without a witness present, is dangerous. And that's why this right is such a fundamental right under our Constitution. And if only guilty people exercise this right, then the right is almost non-existent. If innocent people don't assert their rights, then really it's seriously an erosion of all of our rights, and we're all greatly diminished. So, consider that maybe as part of your activism to strengthen all of our rights. And of course, this doesn't need saying, but the FBI is not just looking for terrorists. They are investigating political movements, especially the peace movement. Certainly, we all know, for 50 years, they've been a monitored movement, and political groups, immigrants, activists have all been targeted for doing nothing more than legal activism. And the government has been fairly successful in being able to interrupt and incapacitate some of those movements. If you've ever watched TV, you've probably heard of your Miranda rights. These are the traditional, you've got the right to remain silent, and People think that if law enforcement does not read them their Miranda rights, that it's somehow going to get them out of trouble. Completely untrue. Whether the police read you that little Miranda card or not, you have these rights. And it's your job as educated citizens to know them and to exercise them without having a cop advise you of your rights. Because certainly, we shouldn't rely on that too much. CLDC, Miranda rights was a little hard for a lot of people to understand. We now call it a demand of rights, and it basically says, I will not talk to you or anyone else about anything. I demand to have an attorney present before I speak to you or anyone. I will not answer any questions or reply to any charges without an attorney present. I do not agree to perform any test, consent to any searches, or participate in any lineups. This is really important. A lot of people don't realize that they have the right to not give a writing sample, a voice exemplar, to get paraded in front of a lineup. You never want to consent to any of these things, and it's such an unusual circumstance for most people to ever be part of their life that you don't really think about it. You don't think you have the right to refuse to be part of a lineup, because whoever thought they would be part of a lineup, but you do. And you'd never want to sign anything unless your lawyer tells you that you should do that. And you'd never want to waive any of your constitutional rights. Now, the one exception to the signing rule, in order for you to be let out of jail, you will need to sign what's called a release agreement. And this is a document that says, I agree to come to court, I agree to maybe pay some bail, I agree not to go back to the federal building for 30 days, or, there can be conditions that the jail is saying, this is how we'll let you out. If you refuse to sign that document, they don't have to let you out. And so I generally advise people, when it comes to push to shove like that, you want to read that document. You'll be surprised how many people just sign it and don't even read it. You do have the ability to negotiate with that person. So if it says something like you can't go on any national forest land at all, which I have seen as a condition, you have the right to say, well, how about just the Willamette National Forest where I was? So you do have the right to sort of negotiate that. And if it is really messed up, like there are crazy things in it, which happens a lot, you just want to sign it and immediately bring it to the attention of your lawyer so that then you can go to court and get it worked out properly. But you're probably still going to need to sign it. Grand juries. I do a whole training on grand juries, so this is just a little brief thing. A subpoena to a grand jury is basically a written order by the court saying that you have to show up to this secret court proceeding and testify under oath about information that the government thinks you have relating to either a criminal investigation or a fugitive. You have the right to an attorney if you are a target of that investigation. If you are a mere witness, you don't have the right to a lawyer. And even if you do have the right to a lawyer, that lawyer has to sit out in the hall and cannot go into the grand jury room with you. You are allowed to leave the grand jury room after every question if you want and confer with that lawyer out in the hall. But when you go back into that jury room, it's just the prosecutor and 24 grand jurors. The purpose of a grand jury is to determine whether a felony has occurred. Every felony, whether it's a drug charge or a murder case, has to go through a grand jury in order to become an official case. And so every single day in Lane County, we have grand juries meeting over, all sorts of stuff. It's very common for the police or the FBI to show up at your door or your office and conduct what's called a knock and talk, which means they knock on the door, and if you're willing to talk to them, they're happy to take your information. Of course, you have the right to say no. And then it's very common for them to say, well, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, and the hard way will involve a grand jury subpoena and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And personally, my advice is to tell them, bring it on, because very often they don't have that grand jury subpoena, and they're just trying to see what they can get out of you. And there are often ways to challenge a grand jury subpoena with lawyers. So you want to at least see if there's something to be done, if you aren't particularly desirous of being part of a grand jury investigation. If you refuse to testify to a grand jury, the government can grant you immunity, which means you no longer have a Fifth Amendment right. You must testify. You are being compelled to testify. If you refuse to testify after being granted immunity, that's when you can be jailed until you decide that you will testify, or until the court determines that jail is not going to convince you to participate. It's called a coercive sanction, which means basically you hold the keys to your own jail cell. If you decide, okay, I've been in jail for a month and now I'll testify, as soon as you say that, you're no longer in jail. They'll bring you back to the grand jury, you testify, you go home. The other way to get around that is if, after a few months, it's very clear that your beliefs are so strong in not participating in a grand jury that you will never be convinced to participate, they then have to let you out as well, because the punitive sanction is no longer doing what it was supposed to do, which was to convince you to cooperate. So this basically is emphasizing these magic words that I mentioned. You should really try to memorize these so that when you are in a stressful situation, these necessary words will come to you easily. So many times people kind of go blank or say crazy things when they're confronted by hostile police officers. And like I said, it's important to just stay in control of your brain and err on the side of saying very little, if anything, to the police at that time. So at that mere conversation level, the cop is going to say, "Hi, can I ask you who organized this event today?" And you are going to say, "Are you detaining me or am I free to go?" And the cop will probably say something, "Well, I just wanted to know who's running the show here. Who should I go talk to?" And then you say, "I choose not to talk to you." And then just slowly making eye contact, you walk away. You don't want to start power walking away because you're going to get jumped probably at that point. So just slowly and carefully walk away from them. In the detention stage, same question, but the cop says, "I'm detaining you. Put your hands against the wall," whatever. And then you have the right to say, in essence, what you're saying is, "What is the articulable basis for my detention, officer?" But the normal English way to say that is, "Why am I being detained?" And like I said, saying those phrases is going to trigger with this cop that they're not going to be able to get away with a lot. And your interactions are going to have a very different tone when they think you actually know what you're talking about a little bit. And then with arrest, they're placing you under arrest, and the magic words are, "I am going to remain silent, I want to contact an attorney," and off you go. If you are not a U.S. citizen or you work with these communities, you have rights. They are changing almost every day, and they are certainly not as strong or protective as if you were a U.S. citizen. You can be deported as a non-U.S. citizen without a lawyer and without a hearing and really without even being told why you're being detained in our current INS setup. And I use INS even though I know that's not the proper word anymore. I think they call it ICE these days, but same thing. You do have the right to talk to a lawyer. You've got to pay for it yourself. There's no right to a free lawyer. You have to carry your immigration papers with you at all times. The immigration laws are really complicated, and we do a specific Know Your Rights training for people working with these communities. But in essence, it's important for you to know that you need to get those people lawyers within 48 hours, because in 48 hours they can be gone. That's how fast deportation proceedings can happen. And if you're a foreign, this applies to us too. As foreign nationals, if you're in another country or if you have a visitor from another country, your rights are greatly diminished at borders and airports, obviously. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the context of airports. But borders, obviously, they can search your car without a warrant, without any probable cause. They can search you. They can detain you. They can keep your cell phone. We've had several instances of people going over to Canada and having all of their outreach literature seized at the Canadian border. So just be aware that borders are a different beast. So you never have to answer any questions about your immigration status, your birth country, nothing like that. And you do have the right to a hearing if you demand it before an immigration court. And airports. So if you've ever turned over your airline ticket and read that little tiny print on the back of it, it basically says you're giving up all your rights by choosing to fly United, so to speak. They have the right to search your bags. They have the right to take anything out of your bags. They can search you. They can scan you. They can run your background, all of it, without any indication that you have broken the law. And of course, they can also charge you with crimes and whatnot. If they find marijuana in your bag, they can obviously prosecute you for that. An airplane pilot can refuse to fly you if they think that you are a threat to the safety of the flight, and it's their subjective standard of what that means. If you are entering the country, the U.S. Customs Service has the right to stop and search every single personal item that you possess. However, you can't be barred from flying because of affirmative action type issues like sex, religion, national origin, et cetera, et cetera. There was a woman who was banned from a flight because she was wearing a t-shirt, and the wording of the t-shirt was in Arabic. It actually said peace now, peace forever, but because it was in Arabic, the airline refused to allow her to fly on that particular day. And that case just made it to the Court of Appeals and was found to be unconstitutional. So you actually do have the right to wear the t-shirt of your choice while flying these days, though in her case it meant that she didn't fly that day, certainly. So, and if that ever does happen to people, obviously that is a violation of your civil rights, and you can contact somebody about that. This I just put up at the end in case anybody does work with these communities. Immigration issues, have been a real hot button issue, as you might imagine, with cops and protesters and stuff lately. So, so that's basically all I have to present. But I'm happy, obviously, there are some gaps to fill with Q&A. So please feel free to ask me any questions you'd like.